Before we start today's video, please remember to subscribe, share our videos with others, and browse the channel to watch other enjoyable videos. The potential for World War III in 1962, often referred to as the Cuban Missile Crisis, came about due to a combination of Cold War tensions, nuclear arms races, and geopolitical maneuvering between two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. The crisis took place between October 16th and October 28th of 1962, and is one of the closest times the world has come to nuclear war. The Cold War was a period of intense rivalry and political tension between the two dominant superpowers, the United States and its Western allies, and the Soviet Union, along with its allies in the Eastern Bloc. Both sides had vastly different ideologies, capitalism in the West and communism in the East, and both sought to spread their influence across the globe, often leading to proxy wars, espionage, and nuclear arms buildup. In 1959, Fidel Castro led a communist revolution in Cuba, overthrowing the U.S.-backed dictator Fulgencio Batista. Castro's rise to power and his alignment with the Soviet Union created a direct threat to U.S. interests in the Western Hemisphere, especially considering that Cuba is located just 90 miles south of Florida. Afterward, the U.S. attempted to overthrow Castro, most notably through the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, which failed miserably and humiliated the U.S. government. In response to U.S. aggression, Cuba sought stronger support from the Soviet Union, which was eager to challenge American power and expand its influence in the Americas. In the early 1960s, the Soviet Union began to deploy nuclear missiles in Cuba. Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, saw this as a way to achieve several strategic goals. The U.S. had long had nuclear missile bases in Turkey, which were within range of the Soviet Union. By placing missiles in Cuba, the USSR could threaten the U.S. with nuclear weapons much more easily. Cuba was seen as an ally and symbol of communist revolution in the Americas. By placing missiles there, Khrushchev aimed to protect Cuba from any future U.S. intervention. Khrushchev believed the U.S. might not be willing to engage in a full-scale war over a communist state just off its shores. In October 1962, U.S. U-2 spy planes flying over Cuba discovered the presence of Soviet nuclear missile sites under construction. The U.S. government, led by President John Kennedy, quickly realized that these missiles, once operational, could strike major cities along the eastern U.S. seaboard, including Washington, D.C., the nation's capital. The discovery of the Soviet missiles in Cuba triggered a tense, high-stakes confrontation between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. President Kennedy addressed the nation on October 22, 1962, announcing that the U.S. had discovered Soviet missile sites in Cuba and warning that any attack from Cuba would be considered an attack from the Soviet Union, triggering a full-scale war. Kennedy chose to impose a naval blockade around Cuba to prevent further Soviet shipments of military equipment to the island. He demanded the removal of the missiles and their launchers from Cuba. Over the following days, the world stood on the brink of nuclear war. The U.S. and the Soviet Union were engaged in a tense diplomatic and military standoff. The U.S. military went on high alert, with plans for an invasion of Cuba being prepared, while Soviet missile crews in Cuba were on standby, ready to launch their weapons if attacked. Both sides engaged in back-channel communications and diplomatic negotiations, with Kennedy and Khrushchev exchanging messages through various intermediaries. The crisis brought the world to the brink of a nuclear conflict, as any miscalculation or miscommunication could have resulted in full-scale war. The crisis ended through a combination of public and secret negotiations. The resolution came in the form of a compromise. Publicly, Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for Kennedy's public promise not to invade Cuba. Secretly, Kennedy also agreed to remove U.S. missiles from Turkey, which were close to the Soviet Union, though this part of the agreement was not made public at the time. Cuba remained a communist state under Fidel Castro, though the removal of Soviet missiles was a significant victory for U.S. diplomacy. The crisis led to the establishment of the hotline between Washington and Moscow to allow direct communication between the leaders of the U.S. and the Soviet Union to avoid future confrontations. In 1963, the U.S. and the Soviet Union and the UK signed the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which banned nuclear tests in the atmosphere, underwater, and in space. That is the end of the video, and on behalf of the OLE 20th Century History YouTube channel, thank you for watching this video, and please remember to subscribe, share our videos with others, and browse the channel to watch other enjoyable videos.